You're listening to episode 305 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Anne Gleig joins us to speak about her new book, American Dharma, Buddhism Beyond Modernity. Hi, everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help, which are listed on that page, and if you make a donation, it's tax-deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us on the conversation. It was just a few years ago that secular Buddhism was an unknown term, and in many contemporary Buddhist circles, unwelcome. Though there are still those who have difficulty with it, the fact is, secular Buddhism has attained a tipping point, as many people now routinely refer to themselves as secular Buddhists. But this isn't the only way in which the teachings and practices handed down through the ages have come to grips with this age and in America. The Secular Buddhist Association features prominently in our guest's new book, along with many other fascinating ways in which people engage with the Dharma. Anne Gleig is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Central Florida. She is co-editor of Homegrown Gurus, From Hinduism in America to American Hinduism, and has published widely on contemporary Buddhism. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice Modernity. I'm not kidding. That's a real thing. Our guest today is Anne Gleig. Anne, welcome to the podcast. Nice to have you here at last.
Hi, Ted. Thank you.
So as I recall, you and I met for the first time several years ago. I think it might have been at a Buddhist Geeks conference.
Yeah, I think it was maybe 2012. Sorry, I always say 2012.
Right.
Yeah, it was the second Buddhist Geeks conference in Boulder, Colorado. The first one in Boulder, but there'd been one in LA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And ever since that time, I've had this open invitation to you to join me on the podcast. And now it was really, I think, kind of unavoidable because you've got a new book that's out. And I'm just so very glad to have you here and talking with us. And I just wanted to make sure that listeners to this are aware, one of the reasons it's so wonderful to be able to have these kinds of conversations is I get to see friends, dear people who are doing great work, and Anne is certainly one of those. So really good to have you here.
Oh, thanks, Ted. I appreciate it.
Well, let's start with that. The first traditional question is just telling us a bit about your background, where you're from, how you got interested in Buddhism, anything you feel might be right for this.
So I'm from Liverpool, hence my, unique Liverpool accent. My first serious introduction to Buddhism really came as a teenager. I went to Bristol University to do my undergraduate degree. And I, went with an interest in Hinduism and Buddhism, and really, got more and more kind of involved with Buddhist studies at the University of Bristol. At that time, there were two really prominent professors. One is Rupert Gethin. He studies the Abhidharma, that's his speciality. And the other is Paul Williams, who at the time, well, his speciality is Mahayana Buddhism. He wrote a great textbook on Mahayana philosophy. So yeah, I just, really immersed myself into Buddhist studies. And then I went to do my MA in Lancaster, and I actually had wanted to continue studying Buddhist philosophy. I wanted to study Huayan, to Buddhist philosophy that took root, really flowered in Chinese Buddhism. But essentially what happened when I went to Lancaster University to do my MA was I really, at that time, kind of postmodernism had really taken off. And I found myself, and post-structuralism, and I basically found myself really questioning, what's the relevance of Buddhist philosophy for me as a, 21-year-old queer kind of feminist. And I was spending I noticed that I was seemed to be more interested in kind of post-structural feminism. So I ended up doing my MA on Jung's feminist critique of Jung's use of Asian religions. So I kind of moved away from classical Buddhist studies. And then, that kind of threw me into a kind of confusion, because I imagined that I'd just do, my MA and then my PhD. But I decided to take some time out, and that ended up being 7 years. I spent the last couple of those years were in Asia, where I, had started practicing Buddhism quite seriously, kind of doing the retreat kind of route. And so I decided I wanted to go back to university to do my PhD. And I'd really been excited by the work of Anne Klein. She, she wrote a great book on Tibetan Buddhism and feminism. And she was talking a lot about, the difference between a Western modern self and an Asian kind of subjectivity is. So I ended up going to Rice University. I thought I'd go more the traditional Tibetan route, but I ended up basically just focusing more on American Buddhism. So it's quite a complicated story, but I have a kind of hybridic background. So my research is really centered around Buddhist studies, but American studies as well. I'm kind of a hybrid. I'm half Americanist, half Buddhologist. So yeah, that's my kind of a little bit of my educational journey into Buddhism.
And that background really lends itself to the topic and the way you handled it, because what I see in this is the tremendous diversity. It's not American Dharma, the monolithic thing of which there is only one variety. You go into those complexities quite a lot. And I want to get into that in a minute, but I want to ask about, you've been writing about this stuff for a while, and it's been really terrific keeping in touch with you online and seeing various articles that you've written. And I'm wondering what made you decide to write this particular book? Is part of that based on just your own eclectic background?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because I ended up doing my PhD dissertation. It was actually a comparative study. I didn't go the traditional Buddhist kind of route. I didn't have, the languages. So I got really kind of close to Jeff Kripal. He's another professor at Rice. And he suggested, he kind of encouraged me to go in the Americanist route. And so I did this comparative study of, basically how Enlightenment kind of discourses, especially non-dual and liberation traditions, had been westernized and Americanized for my dissertation. And my plan was to turn that into a book, that dissertation into a book. But I think, every grad student, after they, finish their dissertations, just like, I don't want to go near it for a while. And so I'd kind of want to take a little break. And then I'd just done these little ethnographic case studies. So I did one on the East Bay Meditation Center in Oakland. That was a center I'd been visiting for a few summers as a practitioner. it's, I was going to their queer sangha and thinking, oh, this is really interesting what's happening here. So I thought, oh, I should do something on this. And then the Buddhist geek sing, that kind of fell out of nowhere. I got I had a bit of extra cash. I wanted to use it so it, didn't lose it at the end of the academic year. And I decided to go to the conference. And then was quite excited, to see some new things happening there. So I basically did those two separate projects. And the thing that really struck me about both of them was, at that time and still, presently, the kind of dominant framework for understanding, Buddhism, Buddhist communities in the West and a lot of contemporary Buddhism in Asia as well is Buddhist modernism. But I felt that Buddhist modernism as a framework didn't fully account for the East Bay or for Buddhist geeks. So two very different communities, but, communities that I felt needed a new framework. So I basically in both, I wrote two separate pieces and basically, argued that they actually showed signs more associated with the postmodern and the post-colonial. And one of those pieces on Buddhist geeks was published by the Journal of Global Buddhism. So I wanted to just give a shout out as an aside to encourage listeners to check out the Journal of Global Buddhism. It's an open access journal. It's an academic journal, but I think, might be of interest. And anyway, so one of the reviewers of the Buddhist Geeks article was Franz Metcalf. He is a senior Buddhist scholar who I owe a lot to. I want to really acknowledge and thank Franz. He basically wrote to me and we started a conversation and he said, you really should turn this thesis into a book. You should develop it. There's a book length project here. So I was, basically looking for any excuse not to go back to my dissertation. And so, I just started working on it. And then I got really lucky. Yale University Press, the editor, the executive editor there, Jennifer Banks, she really took a big risk on me. She gave me an advance contract with only having seen the introduction. And, that really pushed me through, completing the book, having that advance contract because, I didn't want to she'd shown such kind of confidence and good faith in me. I really didn't want to let her down. And so, that's kind of how the American Dharma came into kind of existence.
It's interesting you bring up David McMahon's did a terrific piece, and we interviewed him several years ago about that on modernism, and you do mention that in the book, and yet there was something else. There's something above and beyond that. I'm wondering if you might explore a little bit about, so what is that? What was it that Buddhist modernism didn't quite cover from what you were seeing from these two different communities, and even just those two communities, knowing there are lots more?
Yeah, I mean, again, also want to acknowledge David's work because it's just been a tremendous foundation and springboard for my work and other younger scholars, and he's also a great colleague. So, essentially Buddhist modernism, really focuses on how, traditional forms of Buddhism, were kind of shaped, with the encounter of Western modernity under, either direct or indirect, colonization. So it tends to emphasize like the universal, the individual meditation practice, the kind of Buddha as, an early kind of scientist kind of figure. And with the East Bay Meditation Society, I really saw a kind of pushback on some of those, core features of Buddhist modernism. So, for example, there was a real emphasis on building community. There is a real emphasis still at the East Bay Meditation Center on building community, framed through the rhetoric of the beloved community. So it's kind of revisioning of Sangha. So, some of the communal aspects of Buddhism had been either neglected or discarded entirely, and through the focus on individual meditation practice. And then another thing that happens in Buddhist modernism is, this distinction between, an essential Buddhism or an authentic, pure, original Buddhism and a cultural Buddhism. And so that kind of distinction has ended up, playing out in some, unfortunately, really harmful ways for, actual communities. But I was also seeing some pushback against, that split. And, more thinking about like what should the right, what's the relationship between, American Buddhism, as majority white Buddhist Sanghas and, people of color or Asian American communities. So the diversity and justice work, but also emphasizing difference, not assuming this kind of universal subject that doesn't, exist. So what was kind of happening in that community actually was mirroring postmodern and post-colonial cultural critiques of the modern. So I was basically saying in some ways the EBMC continues the modern, but in these core ways, it actually puts pressure on the modern. And then with Buddhist Geeks, that was, different, because Buddhist Geeks is like the hyper modern, it's like the uber modern. So I think, I don't know whether in the last chapter of my book, I don't know if you've got there yet, but I talk about, we have to think about Buddhism beyond modernity. And I use the postmodern, but I also use the post-colonial and the post-secular, because I think a lot of people, the postmodern is one of those kind of umbrella terms, it means different things to different people. I use it in the sense of, in a very wide socio-cultural sense, of both an extension and a critique of the modern. So I take, I use it in a way that, other people might not use it. So with Buddhist Geeks, I'm trying to remember now because it's been a while since I wrote that. I basically look at how, shifts in technology kind of push the boundaries of the modern. Yeah, sorry, I'm kind of drawing a blank of the specifics, but it's all in the book on the chapter.
It is, and maybe that can lead to another question that you tackle very early and openly and honestly, and that is, you note the complexity in honoring heritage Buddhism, people who are, say, from Asian countries that have a particular way of manifesting Buddhism that might be different than that here, and it's still American Buddhism, and it is a heritage Buddhism because it's not something that I, as a white male, would find myself in appropriately, although I have been in those centers for years. And it is different. And still acknowledging, while that is its own thing, to honor and respect that and not to take over, to avoid cultural appropriation with that, and still acknowledge that not everyone practicing fits into that mold. That's some of the complexities you brought out right away early on. And I'm wondering what are some of the manifestations of American Dharma that you found as you're researching this?
Okay, there's a lot in what you said that I kind of need to unpack a little bit. So early scholarship on Buddhism in America, the first kind of, there was a couple, I think there was a book in the 1970s, I think maybe two books. Charles Prebish did a book, I think, in 79, and Emma Lehman did one before that. There were a couple of books in the 1970s and I think one in the 1980s, and then there was like 3 or 4, kind of heavy books, heavyweights, and like that really started the field. And again, I should also want to give a acknowledgement to Charles Prebish, who did so much to start the academic study. And basically, one of the early distinctions that researchers made was between two types of Buddhism. One was, at the time, they used the term immigrant Buddhism or ethnic Buddhism. And then the other one was convert Buddhism. And for convert Buddhism, they basically conflated convert Buddhism with, basically white middle class kind of converts who were, basically focused on the practice of individual meditation, with the goal of enlightenment. And of course, the problem with even though the term was kind of, the two typologies grew out of, they were meant as descriptions, but as with many descriptive terms, they, become really, they're really problematized in actual embodied context. So it made it kind of mapped on, it gave the either implicit or explicit message that, immigrant Buddhism was not American. It was somehow always foreign to America. So there's a conflation of basically whiteness with America. And also, of course, it made it seem like immigrant communities were cultural baggage Buddhists, and white communities were, above culture and were practicing, culture-free Buddhism. And then,
of course, ridiculous. You can't separate culture as part of being human.
Yeah, well, so, and then there was a critique of that, and that was, the two Buddhist typology. Jan Natya did a new typology of three Buddhists, because she also wanted to point out there were other convert communities that weren't, focused on meditation and were much more diverse demographically. So then, scholars kind of took up the three Buddhist typologies. But then I think there was, some really excellent scholarship that just showed how, these typologies, always kind of lent themselves to kind of racial hierarchies. So I think that, as scholars, it's like we use categories really. It's useful to use categories, right? So it's still the case that in what I call meditation-based lineages, they have been historically very majority white and upper class. And that's where we're seeing a lot of diversity and inclusion work. So I do use the categories, still, but kind of, using them kind of under erasure, for a start, there are a lot of Asian Americans who are practicing in meditation-based Buddhism. So that's one way those categories have been disrupted. Other ways that it's been disrupted are that now you've got Buddhists, white Buddhists being born into convert lineages. So, but they've grown up, like the Shambhala, what do they call them? The Dharma brats. So they're not convert Buddhists, but they're still kind of associated with these convert lineages. So, I mean, essentially what I'm saying is for the researcher, it's quite hard it's like we're using the categories because there is still some truth to them. It is true that these convert-based meditation lineages still have certain characteristics, but they're also being disrupted. And we also, always have to pay attention to, just being really careful that racial, white privilege and racial hierarchies aren't sneaking in. But essentially, I think it's all American Buddhism. It's all American Buddhism. It's not like one Buddhism is more American than the other. Communities have distinct histories, and they're shaped by certain demographics. They're shaped by situations, contexts those demographics find themselves in. But they're all, American Buddhism. And that's why I was, the title of the book is a long story. I wanted to call the book Enlightenment Beyond the Enlightenment. But Yale felt it was too kind of, too theoretical. Like it was a kind of scholarly kind of, nod. So if you weren't in the, scholarly community, it probably wouldn't speak to you. So they were looking for a title that would, have wider appeal. And we went through this whole process, and the end result was I got the subtitle that I wanted, right? I got the academic subtitle. I want to stress that one of the problems with the title is that I don't want, and I say this in the book, right? It's in the chapter. Like, I'm not claiming that meditation-based lineages are the only American Dharma, You
make that very clear in this. If this is not raising any kind of practice or manifestation over the other, this is exploring all of them.
Yeah, so for me, I would, really be trying to disrupt kind of hierarchies and kind of just point to, these diverse forms of Buddhism. So many, there's increasing crossover amongst them. I mean, it might be, in 5 or 10 years, the terms, heritage and convert might have been abandoned completely. But it's a real dilemma. It's a real dilemma because they do point to some distinguishing characteristics, but the terms have been used in ways that have been harmful to heritage Buddhists. So I think that's just, that's a dilemma as a scholar. Like, how do we talk about populations without, reifying these problematics,
Yeah, yeah. So as you were going through this enormously complex process, you talked with a lot of people, you visited many places and did a lot of research. And I'm wondering, during this process, was there some things that came up for you that were, wow, that's really different, or I never would have expected this? What are some of the interesting things for you as you were putting this together that you found?
Because the book was in press for, 12 months, for 12, 14 months. And it was a 3-year project to write it. So just kind of thinking back, over the process. Yeah, I don't know what was kind of surprising. I mean, sometimes one thing that's surprising to me is, sometimes I assume, sometimes I'm surprised at how like different Buddhist teachers, don't know what's necessarily going on in Zen Buddhism. Insight teachers don't necessarily know what's going on in Zen Buddhism. So sometimes I'm surprised by that. Sometimes I, imagine more, I guess. I've been surprised, or sometimes even within their own community, I had asked the teacher, why does this happen? And they're like, I don't know. And I'm thinking, wow, you've been teaching at that center for 20 years. Like, why don't you know? So I guess in some ways, I think I was surprised by what appeared to be sometimes a lack of transparency. I don't know whether, I don't think it was just like the individual teacher was clueless. Like, it did seem there was some structural issues around transparency in large organizations of who made decisions and, why things went a certain way. That came up with the racial justice chapter. I found it quite hard to get. It's a sensitive topic, and I think there was some real heartache in the insight, community around the teacher training process, which I cover in my chapter on, racial justice work. And so, yeah, I found it hard to get. There were some questions that I couldn't get answered. But it just seemed there was some ways in which information wasn't freely flowing, between different levels of an organization. And I think some of that, and also between, I guess I just assumed all the teachers would be friends or colleagues. Yeah. And, and they're not necessarily friends or colleagues, I guess they're colleagues, but, so I'd ask them a question about X and they'd say they didn't know, And I think that, I think that's what's also fueling what I call in the book the collective turn. With these younger generations of Buddhists, there is, there is at least a desire to form, stronger networks. In the Gen X chapter, when I asked, I interviewed 33 Gen X teachers, and they all said, a distinguishing characteristic of our generation is, we want more peer support. We want more peer feedback. Now, that might not actually happen on the ground, right? Because, someone that I or someone else would have to do a follow-up study. Does that desire translate to actual structures of accountability? But it does, it's an ideal, So, yeah, so I think that was a surprise to me. Yeah, I think that's the only thing that's coming up for me now. Sorry.
No, that's all right. That's really interesting. Just the idea of going into it with the idea that, this is ostensibly one topic, Buddhism, and it's in one place, albeit a big place, and it's not everyone on this continent. So it's a particular demographic, and one would think that there's some interchange and some awareness of the background, and not necessarily so. Someone going through priest training in a Zen tradition might not really even be aware. And I speak from my own experience. I spent 10 years in Zen without a clue about even the existence of Theravada. And so just this idea of you go with what's sometimes closest. You got one Zen center way back when I started. That's where you go, and that's the whole of Buddhism for you. And that now, because we didn't have the internet then, there wasn't digital technology, just the sharing and availability of information. And as you're saying, I think a younger generation is more interested in transparency because they're seeing, especially these days, a lack of transparency and a holding on of patriarchal power, of cultural appropriation, and that is something that I don't think they're willing to take or be accepting of, as has been in the past. And this is, I think, a positive change.
Yeah, I think, I guess, thinking back to the Gen X chapter, a kind of common narrative, in the interviews was just this sense of, oh, I found my people, I found kind of like my tribe. I think that was a direct quote off someone. And so I think there was, just this sense of, you know, the Gen X teachers had been doing, their work in their specific communities or in the same community, but in different locations. But then actually getting together, I think for the first time was the Garrison conference. I think it was in, gosh, I don't know. I've forgotten the date. Sorry. Was it maybe 260 or something? They had like a Gen X meeting for the first time in an intentional way. And I think, they all felt like, they heard their own kind of struggles being articulated, from different people. And there was a sense of like a generational kind of struggle. So, yeah. So again, and I think just, different modes of being and kind of, forms of kind of knowledge, but also aspirations, are linked with different generations, as you know. So, yeah, I think, at least aspirationally, the Gen X one, they say they want more transparency, they want a more power sharing, they're more collectively oriented. But that doesn't, again, I want to kind of stress, that doesn't mean it will actually happen.
Right.
We'll have to wait and see, what kind of impact they have, because, I think I am sitting with some of the, in the book, a lot of the Gen X compared themselves to boomers, and they said, the boomers are all rock stars. They're all, they're very individualistic, because they're like the me generation. And, they do these book tours and, and we don't want to be like that. We want to share the mic, we want, no one wants to put themselves on the pedestal. But, since, those interviews, I've seen websites go up of individual Gen X teachers, that look quite like rock starish to me. So, yeah, so I think, again, we always have to think about how, what do people aspire to? What's the rhetoric? And then, what are they actually doing on, in actual reality?
I think that's a very important part. And one of the reasons I'm very glad that you brought up East Bay meditation is that they really do, I think, a really excellent job on practically, here's what we do. Here's the way in which we live these values that we have, that it's not just an aspiration without any teeth. You're really doing it.
Yeah, the East Bay have been really at the forefront, of so much justice work and diversity and inclusion work. And, I think, they're not the only community, of course, but they've definitely, taken a kind of, leading role. And the teachers at the East Bay, Larry Young and Mushim.
Keda, yeah.
Yeah, so, and many others, have also traveled, around other insights and communities and kind of shared, their wisdom and their on the ground experience. So, yeah, I think they've been a really pioneering community. And, I've been, I've kind of had a relationship with East Bay for a really long time. I think I first went there as a practitioner, maybe, I'm trying to think, maybe 10 years ago. And yeah, I've just seen them kind of, it's been really gratifying to watch them grow and also to kind of shape some of the conversations, within the wider community, because a lot of the stuff they were doing was so marginal, and it is still marginal. If you look at any kind of comment thread on a diversity and inclusion article, you can still see so much backlash, so much kind of, why are you splitting the Sangha, and, a lot of kind of white kind of rage and fragility. But it's definitely, gaining momentum, and they've been, really instrumental to that. And so many individual figures that aren't all named in the book. So yeah, no, they've done a lot. And a new community that's just started that's quite interesting to me is the San Francisco Dharma Collective. So that's one of the groups that's kind of arisen out of the ashes of Against the Stream. And if you Google San Francisco Dharma, I think it's collective, if you look at I think it's called a vision statement. I don't think it's called a mission statement. I think they use a vision statement. That it's, all of the rhetoric at least is, very collective, all about transparency, all about marginalized populations. So I think that we're probably going to see more communities like that. And we're going to see pushback and continuing opposition, So I just think there's going to be more and more, more like, I think there's going to be multiple expressions of Buddhism or post-Buddhism that's happening.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing is how we have those conversations, because it's not easy, it's complicated, as you said, and there's going to be moments where, through hopefully an innocent ignorance, we make mistakes. I've made plenty myself. I'm going to make plenty more. And how do we bring those moments in and go, yep, and that needs to change. And here's what we're going to do to actually change it. So folks who are listening, we're going to link to what Ann just mentioned about San Francisco, and of course East Bay, and some other things as well. But yeah, it's how a lot of this is how can the Dharma help inform how we have the conversation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think for a start, it's best not to have the conversation online. The online forum is probably the worst possible space to have these conversations. I haven't really seen I'm not sure if I've ever seen one productive conversation, online around this topic. But I was really kind of heartened in a way to see. I gave a keynote at the Soto Zen Buddhist Association conference in September. And I was presenting on basically decentering whiteness. And I was looking at the work of, I'm basically just, recording and kind of analyzing the work of Buddhists of color. I'm just recording. It's all the credit is to them. It's just, I'm just recording it and, theorizing it. But I looked at Larry Yang's kind of body of work, and also Zanyu Earthlin Manuel, who's been just an extraordinary figure in Soto Zen Buddhism. And I was really kind of surprised and kind of happy, as someone who thinks this work's really important, to find that there were groups at the Soto Zen Buddhist Association who have been doing, white awake work within the context of a Buddhist context, in, I think, Minnesota, in Oregon. I wouldn't necessarily have thought of Minnesota because, I cover mostly the big centers on the coast, and that's one of the things I say at the end of the book. Much more work is needed to track these patterns, more regionally. So, it was kind of really, it was really amazing to be like, wow, I think it was Minnesota. I hope I'm remembering it right. But, they've been doing like a year's, worth of white awake in their Zen Sangha. So I think, more Buddhist communities are realizing that, as well-intentioned as nearly everyone in the Sangha is, that, racism and whiteness are structural forces, that niceness, doesn't abate, and that manifests in lots of harmful ways. And I think, also, like you say, it's a learning curve for all of us, so in my early work, a lot of my work was really kind of defending the westernization, the modernization, Americanization of, Buddhism. And that was really unpopular in Buddhist studies. Buddhist studies has historically been a very conservative field that really privileges textual studies. And, it was quite mind-blowing to me, actually, because, I'd always go to American, the Americanist kind of section, the workshops and the new religious movements, because there's a big overlap between American studies and new religious movements. And then I go over to the Buddhist studies session, like the sessions in the big academic conference.
Yeah.
And, in the Americanist, sections and the new religious movement sections, the methodologies would be these, these communities, these new communities, because it's like new religious movements, that people would be really enthusiastic about and kind of tackling the hybridity. And then I go to Buddhist studies, and the same, communities that were similar in Buddhist studies, if they had any kind of hybridity, if they were living communities, both heritage and convert, they were really kind of like dismissed, like they weren't real Buddhism. And I was like, wow, I couldn't believe it. It was like, these critiques would never fly in new religious movements. Like, so I kind of pushed to, like, we shouldn't just dismiss as scholars these living Buddhist communities. They are like lived religion.
Right.
And a lot of scholars, didn't like that, but a lot of scholars did somehow, because I've actually ended up being quite successful in Buddhist studies. So I think it's important to, realize that, to think of Buddhism as it's a lived religion that's always, there's universal Buddhist doctrines, but they're always being enacted through specific bodies and in specific historical and socio-cultural contexts. And as long as, that, is the case, I think we'll always see multiple Buddhisms, And I'm very, basically positive about that. I just think, that's kind of my kind of orientation generally.
Well, it can't appear in a vacuum. It's always going to be based on people. This is not a dead language that's taught to, high schoolers for language credit, like Latin. This is something that is very much alive and changing, and it is encountering cultural pressures that are unprecedented.
Yeah.
How information is shared, how much is there, the literacy of anyone who's touched by this. It's no longer the given monastic who is within a few miles of where you live, and they give a talk, and then it's gone forever. It's like, no, it's anything that's recorded and out online in the world that you have access to. And that itself is changing things. People have a much more eclectic set of speakers and views that they can find. So I would say it's going to be increasingly challenging to find a single pure. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. And, I just find, I just find a lot of dangers around, kind of politics or traditions of purity. But
Right.
on the other hand, just to kind of bring the other perspective in, there is, of course, a huge question of, a huge fact, that Buddhism, modern Buddhism formed under the conditions of colonialism, and, is, as it, is manifesting in America, is still manifesting in a country still riddled with racism and white privilege. And so, it's like how to allow and embrace, for lived religious life, like across different Buddhist populations. I mean, it's not as if white Buddhists are the kind of, the only Buddhists who, adapt Buddhism, I mean, Buddhism's always been adapted in, amazing ways. But I don't know, I think just, for me, it's like, as someone who's kind of really pushed and, defended kind of modernization, Western iterations, American convert iterations, like it's, I think psychology in Buddhism is legitimate, but then the challenge is, what is the line between, modernization and whiteness? Like, how do, what's the dance between cultural change and, the reestablishment of racial hierarchies? And so I think that's something that I didn't really think about, to be honest, in my early work. I wasn't really engaged in race. But Joseph Cheer's book was a big influence on me. He talks about the slippage between a cultural rearticulation of a tradition and a racial rearticulation. So in the in the cultural, adaptation, Buddhism takes root in different cultures and takes on, the flavors of those cultures and is formed in relationship to the culture. But then in the racial rearticulation, it's when like systems of hierarchical racial systems become kind of encoded within that cultural adaptation. So that's a real, that's been kind of a that's been an ongoing kind of theme for me to kind of look at and kind of interrogate in my own scholarship.
Yeah, we'll never be bored. We'll never be bored in this.
I know. I mean, there's just so much to consider, all the time. And I think, just being in dialogue, and really listening to people, especially friends, it helps if you've got a relationship. That's, just kind of pushes you as a scholar and a practitioner, I guess.
Yeah. Ways we can challenge and inquire and collaborate, even in not knowing or disagreeing or having different ways in which this is showing up for us. How can we still be supportive and, good heavens, friendly about it? So, is there anything else you want to share with the listeners?
The book is much more articulate. My writing is more articulate than I am. I guess encourage people to read the book. I think one thing that I'd like to add is, the book was written, for other scholars, my colleagues, and especially, the theoretical parts of the book, which is really this conversation about Buddhism in modernity, Buddhism in post-modernity, and, post-colonial, post-secular. So there's that kind of framework of the book. But I think for those readers, the audience who might not be as interested in theory, I think, the case studies in the book, I think, stand alone. I think they're very, well, I hope, obviously get some feedback from readers. But I'd wanted to write them in a way that was accessible to practitioners, and that was helpful to practitioners, to help them join some of the dots together of their own experience. So, I think, that I just think of the book in kind of two ways. And one way it's a theoretical conversation, and then another way it's like what's happening, right now in American meditation-based convert lineage.
Great way to put it. So, Anne, I wonder if we could come back to something that you were just briefly touching on before, which is you mentioned Buddhist geeks from our friend Vince Horn and postmodernism. And I'm wondering if you can expand on that just a little bit.
Yeah. So thanks for asking me again. So again, I use the postmodern in the book both as a radical continuation of the modern and also as a kind of critique of the modern. So with Buddhist geeks, they definitely carry on the kind of scientific framing of the Buddha that is, very kind of central to Buddhist modernism. They use a lot of, scientific language, and they kind of update it to technological language. They also continue, a focus on individual meditation experience. However, there are ways in which they display traits more associated with the postmodern. So one way is that in postmodernity, we see a kind of destabilization of, one kind of meta-narrative. And Buddhist geeks, I think really emphasizes pluralism. So it basically, they basically are based in the kind of premise that Buddhist narratives are not sufficient to, capture the whole of experience. And so they're very enthusiastic about bringing in other narratives to kind of articulate experience. So you really see that kind of multiplicity, the kind of pluralism and hybridity. They also, another term that's very associated with the postmodern is bricolage, this kind of creative drawing of different elements. So one way that's really expressed in Buddhist geeks is hacking the Dharma. They talk about, basically drawing from these different systems. And then, when we talk about postmodern religion, we often talk about religion that combines the religious and the secular, that draws on a kind of consumer approach and also kind of mixes up high and low culture. So I think you really see that in Buddhist geeks. They have a lot of, discourse around Buddhism as play, Buddhism as, through video games. So you've got this kind of playful kind of approach to practice that is, definitely considered a mark of the postmodern. So yeah, they're just a few extra extra things. But it's all in the chapter, much more coherently.
Read the book is the important message here.
Oh my gosh, I can't even keep up with my own research. I'm embarrassed.
Well, for those of you who are listening, of course, I'm going to have several links on the episode page for this episode, along with, of course, a link to the book itself. Our guest today, Anne Gleig. Anne, thank you so much. Really good to see you. Glad we finally got to do this.
Thank you, Ted.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.